Senior Associate in Religious Life here, and welcome you to the Office of Religious Life, University Religious Center, and to an event that's been put together by the Widtsoe Foundation, which is all about Mormon studies here, LDS studies on our campus. And I just want to say that the Widtsoe Foundation, so far, a lot of what they've done, most of what they've done on our campus, is interfaith in nature. It really celebrates what this center is all about. And this is no exception. What was it, 2 years ago now? We did an event on sacred garments. And there's still a piece of linen from that display and that scholarly discussion that came of that. It was put together by LDS Church with Widtsoe in our office. And so we still have a relic of that wonderful event dangling in the Fishbowl Chapel. So if you're in there, you can see it now, even with the display going on. There's a little bit of it you can see. But that's a great example of what this wonderful foundation has done for our office and for our campus, is to create these kind of interfaith conversations, because that was all about ritual garments in all faiths, many faiths, and how they connect the seamless weave and connection through fabric. It's a very fascinating discussion that we had. This time we're doing one around the temple of the tabernacle of Israel, the traveling construct that went with the people as they were on their 40-year exile through the Sinai. And this wonderful replica was put together here in Southern California based on biblical specifications. And we wanted to put up the whole puppy here on campus. But oh boy, it's big. And we're a small campus. So we did the best we could. And we brought a foreshortened version of it here. And we were very pleased to have this amazing display. Again, to inspire a truly interfaith kind of discussion about not just this sacred space, but how it relates to all kinds of ideas that we have among all the different faiths about sacred space. We just got a tour with Jack Welch this morning that really illustrated those topics that go beyond Judaism, Christianity, and all its manifestations. Far beyond that in terms of the way there's this universal human urge to create sacred space, set apart space. And how we do that is truly cross-cultural, interreligious. So I want to welcome you all to this discussion. We're especially focusing in this discussion on the way that exile and movement of populations and religions, how religions that have been pushed into exile, forced into exile, how that has affected the faith, how that has affected the expressions of the faith, how it's affected expressions of sacred space as well. And we're going to explore that together. We have a great panel here, and let's get going. Welcome to it. We'll start with Silva, Sevlian, who's our director of our Armenian studies program here on campus, and she's my good karma pal. So we hang out and talk about all things Armenian over kitchery, over Vaishnava Indian Hindu food. You know, just another sign of what goes on here at the University of Southern California.
Jim, I appreciate the promotion. I'm an associate director of the
Excuse me.
And I want to thank the Office of Religious Life for creating such a forum. It is really, you guys take the open door policy to a whole another level. Good Karma, as you may have heard, is an opportunity to come and eat here. They offer mindfulness classes, which just help with everything, including mental health. And these types of panel discussions where we get to meet professionals like Jack Welch and talk about things that are very timely, like the refugee crisis, being a refugee, being a displaced person, feeling like a displaced person. I don't know how many of you got a chance to see the tabernacle before coming in here. But a lot of the things that you'll see there we'll discuss on this panel, particularly the idea of survival, what it means to reinvent yourself, the role of religion in doing that, in feeling like there's a home. And a lot of the rituals that we heard about during the tour this morning are threads that go through many religions. And so today you'll hear from Varun, who is a wealth of knowledge. He'll speak about the Hindu experience, the Buddhist experience, just in general, the Indian experience, but other religions. Jack Welch will speak to us about the Mormon experience, and Gegham Mughnetsyan, who's also my colleague at the Institute of Armenian Studies, will speak to us about the Armenian Orthodox traditions and its history with displaced persons and refugee life. And so this is going to start with each individual sharing a little bit about the community's history, and then we are going to have a discussion. It's a small group, so we'll ask questions and learn. So, Gegham Mughnetsyan, not further ado.
Hello everyone, thank you very much for having me at this panel. Earlier today we had the wonderful opportunity to tour the replica of the tabernacle. And then one thing to connect that to the Armenian experience is that the colors of the Armenian flag are the replica of the curtains of the tabernacle, which later became the curtains of the Temple of Solomon. So red, blue, and gold, or in Armenian case, I prefer orange, is the symbolical replica of that. The reason why this particular discussion speaks very much to our community, to the Armenians, is that aside from the fact that Armenians have been very much involved in religion in the past 2,000 years, for the past 700 years in Christianity itself, for the past 1,000 years, Armenians in one way or another have lived in dispersion. So they have lived all around the world, aside from their historical homeland. So what has happened is that this religious identity of the people has had to travel with them throughout the world. The last Armenian kingdom was destroyed in the 14th century, and then after that, until achieving modern independence, for 600 years Armenians didn't have a state or something that would guarantee their religious life. So in a way, church itself, for a lot of these people who traveled around, became the only institution around which they gathered. So Armenians built churches wherever they went to, and then this is the oldest church in Singapore is an Armenian church. The oldest church in Dhaka, Bangladesh is an Armenian church. Randomist places where Armenians first went as communities of traders, and then others came around, and then the first thing they put up was usually a church. And these churches go back to 16th, 17th centuries all over the world, where Armenians gathered around these places, where a church, aside from it being a very religious institution, became even more so a cultural, a community center, around which this very sacred space, people gathered to see other representatives of the community. Same thing happens in the United States, where almost 1.5 million Armenians find their residence today. And wherever you go to these places where there are churches, where there are Armenian dioceses established, Armenian church as centers, aside from it being a very religious sanctuary, it is also a very real, living, breathing community space, which usually has a school, has this various activities for children, dance groups, particularly for Armenians, language classes, literally a place where people gather. So this idea of gathering, in itself a very Christian thing on which the whole faith is usually based on, this idea of gathering, of sharing bread, of communion, transcends from becoming this just a very religious thing to actually being the base of a community around which a community is built and survives. Something similar to the tabernacle itself, which was a traveling church, Armenians didn't have a traveling church, but Armenians who lived in Iran for 400 years after they were driven to Iran and had to live there, in most villages and parts of Iran where my own grandparents are from, a lot of these places there wouldn't be enough priests to cater to this massive amount of people in these villages. And then during the lack of transportation, for a priest to move from village to village to village wouldn't take days, it would take weeks sometimes. So usually around Easter, which for Christians is the holiest of the days, and then on the day where usually the Great Lent ends, and then it ends when you first finally, after 48 days of fasting, you receive the first communion. In order to pass the communion, there wouldn't be enough priests available to pass this. So what the priests would do is that they would take the communion bread and then pass it out to the heads of the families, who would themselves take it to their individual families, and during the Easter dinner, literally pick it apart and then put it in a glass of wine and then pass it around as a communion. This is literally in an absence of a church, in an absence of a priest, the communion would kind of travel from this place. So in a lot of Iranian Armenian families who have moved to the United States since 1979 and then have mostly lived in Los Angeles area, this has carried around. Even though there are Armenian churches present now, on Easter you can go get communion, you have a lot of faithful who come on Easter asking for the bread so they can take it home and then do their own communion. Which doesn't make sense anymore because there's a church, but then the tradition is just of it to give out bread to people, blessed bread, to take it home to do it. So the church and the religious part of it in dispersion, for these communities who live in dispersion, who have become diasporas, it grows from this very solid place to turn into this idea that travels around, that people take, and then basically make it very much inherent to the place that they end up in. So it makes sense now in the place that they are. So for now, that's it. The rest, I guess, we'll continue in discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Gegham, for that nice introduction about the Armenian experience with refugees and immigration. As a Mormon or Latter-day Saint, I relate to the tabernacle that you see here because, as has been mentioned, it's a portable temple. And in antiquity, almost all civilizations had temples, but they were not movable temples. And what happened here under the necessity of the fact that Israelites were now refugees from Egypt, they had to invent the idea of a mobile device. Well, it's not quite your mobile device that we use today, but it was a mobile device that would allow them to remain in contact with their God, with their people, with their religion. It's kind of a modern concept to think of being able to transport your religion with you. From a Latter-day Saint perspective, our refugees have been able to take their religion with them. And that's been something that's been modeled on the scriptural accounts of how that happened in antiquity. But we can learn from the tools of how these people did this in some very interesting ways. Now let me begin by saying that as the editor of BYU Studies, which is the premier Mormon journal in academic life, the last issue that just came off the press last Friday, so this is still, the glue is still not quite dry. The second article in this journal is on theological and ethical perspectives on immigration. So how about that? If you'd like to just pass this around, you can take a look at that as we go. But this tells you that Latter-day Saints have had a lot of experience with immigration and refugees. Now, Mormonism began in the early 19th century, and drew on converts that came from all over the world. So many who came to the centers of Mormonism and eventually to Utah had left their homelands. Some came as families, but many came as individuals. And so in a way, they were all displaced people. But for every one of them, they came as a matter of choice. They had left situations, many places where they were persecuted or underprivileged, but they chose to come looking for a new and better life. And I think refugees today, even the ones that have to leave under the most extreme, excruciating, punishing situations, if you can get out of Syria, you are still doing it by choice. It may be, in a way, a choice you'd rather not, but it's better than the alternatives. And I think for Latter-day Saints, we have always recognized that we are here of our free will. We formed a new community. We want to help each other as a community. We don't look back to want to be vengeful or punish the people who maybe have treated us badly. We're happy to be where we are and to look forward. And I think with our engagement with lots of refugees and immigration situations today, as Latter-day Saints, we try to convey that to them as well. There's hope. There's optimism. As Latter-day Saints, we went out into unexplored territory, sometimes into frontiers. Why? Mainly because we wanted things to be better for our children, our posterity, than they had been for our ancestors. And that's a driving power among Latter-day Saints, to be always optimistic, trying to make things better for the next generation. I even like to look at the preamble to the Constitution as kind of a religious document. Or in the preamble, the last thing it says is to secure the blessings of liberty. This sounds like religious language, by the way. Blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. The people who founded the United States of America were in themselves a type of pioneer. They were refugees. And if they had lost the Revolutionary War, they would have all been executed as traitors. But why did they do that? To secure blessings, not just for themselves, they weren't just thinking about today, but for their posterity. And from my experience with refugees, I know that that's the thing that drives so many of them. If we can do better for our children, we shall. So, some of the tools that helped our people to do this were, number one, the Scriptures. Not only does the Bible tell the stories about Israel becoming a refugee leaving Egypt, but we have another set of scriptures called the Book of Mormon. And that Book of Mormon begins with a refugee family being forced into exile from Jerusalem and leaving to go to a foreign new land and building a whole civilization based on that. But repeatedly in the Book of Mormon, we have stories over and over again about conflicts where people, rather than fighting, rather than having problems with the people, would prefer to say, we will go somewhere else, partly so that we can have the religious views that we want, but also because they didn't want to be a cause of further dissension or problems. So we have the Scriptures that give us a model. We also have record keeping. We ourselves are told to keep records, and we advise people, refugees that we work with, to also keep records, to write down their own stories. In the archive of Utah history, there are thousands of pioneer journals where, even though these people were out in the middle of the wilderness, they wrote down what they were experiencing and what they were feeling. And that not only strengthened them as refugees, but they wanted their record to be left behind. Psychologists talk about the survival witness instinct that was experienced by many people in the Holocausts of not only in Germany and Russia, but I assume the Armenian Holocausts as well, where one thing that people more than anything else want to do is be able to tell their story so that they will not be forgotten. Record keeping is a big part of what we do there. Recently, and the BYU Studies article talks at length about a new program that we initiated in our church in 2016 called I Was a Stranger. This, of course, is a line from Matthew chapter 25. I was a stranger and you took me in. We feel a strong moral and religious obligation because we were once strangers. We were once wanderers in a foreign land, to also take anyone in who asks for our help. We have a way set up for people to be helped, to be integrated into community and family life, to have a place where they feel like they have a community that they can be a part of. A lot of what we do is language training. One of the most difficult things people have when they come to a new situation is being able to communicate. So our German church organizations will teach refugees from Syria how to speak German. People here in the United States speaking English. So we want to enable those kind of experiences. Let me just read to you a couple statements which I think will give you the spirit of what we are trying to do with helping out with immigrants. The church statement says, immigrant beliefs and traditions should be celebrated and not dismissed. And refugees should be given greater organizational participation and welcome into the ordinary lives of local citizens. It goes on to say, the history of mass expulsion or mistreatment of individuals or families is cause for concern, especially where race, culture, or religion are involved. This should give pause to any policy that contemplates targeting any one group, particularly if that group comes mostly from one heritage. Finally, it says, in furtherance of needed immigration reform in the United States, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormon Church, supports a balanced and civil approach to a challenging problem, fully consistent with its tradition and of compassion, its reverence for family, and its commitment to the law. Immigration is not to be discouraged. It's a fact. It happens. And from that, we go forward to make the best of it as we can, recognizing the economic role that immigrants play as workers and as taxpayers and citizens eventually. The compact that the church has signed in Utah says, we must adopt a humane approach to immigration, reflecting our unique culture, history, and spirit of inclusion, and I think that's a lot the American way generally. The way we treat immigrants will say more about us as a free society and less about our immigrant neighbors. So that's a starting point for how we've been approaching this. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Very grateful to my panelists for their wise, insightful words. I'm very grateful to all of you for being here. Especially grateful to the Widtsoe Foundation, not just for this event, but for all the extraordinary work they do in terms of interreligious and multi-religious education. So very grateful to partner with Widtsoe. But you know, I'd be remiss if I didn't say this. If I didn't say that today's a sad day for all of us here. It's been a sad week. Many of you might have known that one of our beloved students, McKenna Martin, passed away on Wednesday. It's been devastating since that time as we all reconcile sort of a lot of different emotions that we have about her untimely death. If you knew her and loved her, I just invite you to join us this evening, 7 p.m. at the North Theater. We're going to do a celebration of life service, and her family is here as well. In thinking about the celebration of life service, her religious faith came up, and we're thinking about how to best honor her life as a Christian, in addition to honoring her life in so many different areas. And it's because when we talk about life and death, when we talk about fundamental issues, religion is really front and center of those issues. So in issues that deeply implicate what it means to be human, issues that involve life and death, that involve a sense of purpose and meaning, that involve a sense of belongingness or community, religion has always played a lead role. And I think that's why this conversation is so important, to connect the past to what's happening in our life today. Every religious figure that I know of, or every major figure, every major tradition, has a history of exile, of being a refugee, of being alienated, of being displaced. Of course, Moses, even though he led his people out of slavery and into freedom, he never got to see the promised land. He spent most of his life displaced, in exile, in the desert. Jesus was a refugee. Jesus would have been undocumented in today's day and age. Muhammad was pushed out of Mecca. Rama, the great Hindu king, was exiled for 14 years. And the great celebration of Diwali, which is the most important Hindu liturgical event, is the celebration of Rama's return from exile after 14 years. Buddha went into self-exile after he left the palace and vowed never to return until he achieved enlightenment. Of course, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, were pushed out of their communities. They led communities in exile as well, etc., etc., etc. We don't have to look so far. The Sikh leaders, the Sikh gurus, spent most of their time outside their seat of power, in conflict with the Mughal rulers at the time. The 5th and 9th guru were murdered, decapitated, in a bid to claim a homeland. So at the heart of every tradition is the notion of exile, alienation, being a refugee, being the other. Not just in terms of the scriptural or theological understanding of the tradition, but in terms of the lived experiences of the prophets, the messiahs, the imams, the rabbis, the Buddhas, the spiritual teachers who we know and love. And so we don't have to look very far into our own traditions to see that. And that's why, in my other role here as Vice-Provost of Campus Wellness and Crisis Intervention, that's why over the last year I've been really happy to see faith leaders taking a principled stance on immigration and refugee issues. It's been a brutal year in the United States and on our campus, at least really over the last 15, 16 months. I work very closely with DACA students. We have dozens of DACA students who are concerned about their fate. They're not sure what tomorrow will bring. We have dozens of DACA staff who will actually lose work authorization if they lose their DACA status. They have their whole livelihood at stake. We have 250 students who are directly caught up in the first Muslim ban. And in this most recent iteration, we still probably have hundreds of students who are involved. We have dozens of students from Turkey who are caught up in the Turkish ban. And then there's the refugee ban, right? It's been really tough to be here at the University of Southern California, trying to be close with our students as they wrestle with realities that are beyond their control. But in a country that's as religiously identified as the United States, I'm surprised we haven't seen more of a backlash, quite frankly. I'm surprised people haven't mined their own traditions to say this is not who we are as a country, and this is not who we are as religious people. And my hope is that we don't think of our own religious traditions as something that happened in the past, but rather as texts to live by. The people that we venerate were geniuses in the art of living, and we're all trying to become better at the art of living. We're all trying to become fully realized human beings. And if we're not going to look at their life examples in a way that makes sense for us, then we're really not translating faith into action, which is our opportunity here at the course. The other thing I'd say about this is we're talking about a physical exile, where one's body is removed from one's homeland in various ways. It could be pushed out, displaced, it could be relocated, concentration camps, etc. Any number of ways that your physical body is displaced. But I also think this idea of exile, displacement, being a refugee is a spiritual idea too. Fundamentally, all of us are trying to find a spiritual center, a spiritual home. a place of belonging. We're social beings who flourish in community. We have tribal identity. We're trying to find our tribe. And I think the act of returning to one's homeland or house of worship or community, the physical act, is in many ways emblematic of the act of returning to one's spiritual truth. That might be a return to one's God, to one's faith, to one's spiritual community, to an idea of home that one might have. But the pain of separation that we feel from truth, or that we feel from God in some ways, helps us think through the pain of separation that people feel from family and from country and from homeland. And I think these two things are intimately connected, that we're on two journeys. A physical journey for a place where we can hold space, and a spiritual journey that reconnects us with who we really are. And those journeys to me aren't different journeys. So as we think about the physical manifestations of what it means to be a refugee or be an exile or be displaced, what we think about the physical structure of the tabernacle, let's also think about the tabernacle in our own heart that we are all trying to return home to, with a sense of meaning and purpose, authenticity and significance, and ultimately with a sense of what it means to be human.
Thank you to all of our panelists. I'm gonna ask a couple of questions and then we're gonna open it up to the audience. So the first question is regarding taking faith into action. I want to know what, if anything, your communities have done in the recent months to respond to refugee communities. And the second question I have is in regard to what a place of worship means for people in transit. Is in terms of identity and building on their own identity and recreating their homes.
Sorry, Whitney. For the first question, what the community has done to address, particularly about the religious community, what it has done to address refugee crisis all over the world. I wouldn't be the person who would know that about much because I'm not involved. All I know is that the church itself that's in here does a lot of work with people who are still back in mostly connection with Armenians in Syria because of their presence of large numbers of Armenians in Syria. Work with them who are still stranded, mostly in Aleppo and in areas like that. But what it has as a community in its entirety done to those stranded in the United States or against the ban, I couldn't say that it has done much. The community itself is in this situation where there are actually Armenians in the Quran and stuff. So for many years, in general, it had tried to maintain some kind of neutrality to not upset any sides, but the silence is there isn't much. On the other side of the question about religious institutions in the part of transition, there is quite a bit of a history in that. Armenians who were being pushed out from their lands right after World War II in the western areas of the Soviet Union and then ended up in German camps. Ended up bringing their little religious, whatever identity they had with them. And sometimes it was reborn in the German camps because Soviet Union was an atheist state. So these Armenians, most of them had no idea what religion had been other than the symbolic knowledge of it. And then in German camps, it was all suddenly revived, and then when they moved to the United States, they brought it up. Similar is my generations. I was born after the Soviet Union, but then in Armenia, still lingering of the Soviet past with me. People are not very much aware of the church or religion, everything is. On the other side, the LDS church has done a lot of work in Armenia itself. The city that I was born in Gyumri, right after the earthquake in 1988, the John Huntsman Foundation and the church itself did a massive amount of rebuilding effort. They built even a church there. So they came out to this area and did this. And everywhere, people from everywhere. And so now it is going through this rebirth in a way, and then immigrants from Armenia that go to these places in America kind of get closer to their Armenian religious identity than they were, let's say, in Armenia growing up in the Soviet Union. So yes, in short answer, it has a significant role in transition.
Right. I mentioned the I Was a Stranger program. Let me say a little bit more about that because it, I think, can give you some personal perspectives on what you might do. I hope as a part of this panel discussion we'll all walk away with some ideas about how we could be more effective in dealing with and recognizing the problems that come with refugees and immigration and the stress that they are certainly under. In our community, we start with some very basic things. We tell stories, for one thing, about what we're doing and share these experiences. I've heard stories about a Mormon congregation near a refugee camp in East Germany, and the one thing the people there didn't have was transportation. So they went around and collected as many bicycles as they could and repaired them and made them possible for them to all have a way of just getting to where they needed to go. This was a huge step in terms of integration, of enabling and facilitating and welcoming. People who are in stress often need friendship more than anything else. They're struggling, but they want to know that they're not alone in their struggle. My daughter-in-law, living in St. Louis, has adopted a Syrian refugee family and have helped them find an apartment to live in and furniture and dealing with health and school situations for their children. It's true that we have big institutional problems to deal with in this world. But as I said, what we do in these situations will tell us more about ourselves personally maybe than about our national situation. We can't sit back and wait for the government to somehow solve this problem. There are probably people close to you that could use some help. And it's a personal responsibility, and I think that's kind of the general Mormon approach to things, is to tell people to love one another and to be good at the personal level, to befriend and assist and help. We try to institutionalize this, and the institutions can do things like deploying church leaders or employees, telling them that they need to be attentive to these situations. We have Mormon missionaries who do a lot more than just preach the gospel or knock on doors. Every week they render community service in all kinds of ways, and much of this is devoted toward helping people who are refugees or in extreme conditions. But the other thing that our church has done a lot of, and I mentioned this Utah Compact, although we believe in a separation of church and state, we also realize, and Joseph Smith set the example for us, that working together cooperatively with government is important for religion. That we don't want the state to try to control what we do religiously. Thomas Jefferson talked about a wall of separation between church and state. But his first draft of that did not indicate that the wall was somehow impermeable, that it was a wall of absolute division. But he talked about a way in which at least there could be a good communication and flow of assistance back and forth. That yes, they're separate, but not hostile. And so we try to work together as a church to influence programs that are being talked about in the public sphere. And that's why we've adopted some policies that they don't, they don't solve every problem, but they hopefully make people sensitive to what needs to be done.
Well, what I'm really impressed with when I visit the great work that's being done in Utah by the LDS is that in all of the philanthropic disaster relief and support work that you do, I would say 99% of the people who are beneficiaries of that work are not Mormons.
Correct.
And to me, that is really translating faith into action. It's not translating faith into action for the purposes of proselytizing or converting. And there's a long history of that, especially if you come from a former colonial country like I do. But rather, it's really taking the tenets of the faith and operationalizing the idea that you are your brother's keeper, your sister's keeper, we are one family, we are children of God. What does that actually mean, even in serving others who might not share that idea? So that to me was really the most powerful part of my trip actually to Utah. I got to meet all sorts of great academics, and as a professor I love that. But I what really moved me is to see people praying with their feet, and that's what I saw in the work that your organization
Thank
does.
you.
So, for me, I think, listen, the person who's really influenced me most in my life, really, outside of my family, is the person I also consider my spiritual teacher, and that's the Dalai Lama. I got to meet the Dalai Lama for the first time when I was a college student. I was living in a monastery in India, and it was a very fortuitous encounter. It wasn't planned, but when it happened, it changed the course of my life. And I've gotten to spend a lot of time with His Holiness over the last 20 years, including bringing him to USC in 2011, which was really like the highlight of my life. I should have retired after that. All downhill since then. What I learned from His Holiness is here's someone who spent most of his life in exile. He was the leader of his country, and he was pushed into exile at 16. And one of the challenges in talking about any exile situation is the politics. Of course, people can debate the politics of what caused the situation, but I don't think anyone can really debate the pain that the situation has caused. And what had happened with the Tibetan people is that their leader has been in exile in India since the late 50s. So I've spent, and I've also met a lot of Tibetans who were really brutally imprisoned and tortured, and yet were telling me about how important it was to forgive their captors. When I was spending time with the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala, India, every morning he would welcome Tibetan refugees who would come over the Himalayas to see him. 3 months in transit. Some of them had lost relatives along the way, sunburned, frostbite. That's hard travel over 18,000 foot, peaks. It took me 10 days just to hitchhike from Lhasa to Kathmandu, and I was in a car or in a truck. So, and these folks are coming by foot. And yet, despite the pain that he saw of his own people and his own, I think, pain of being unable to support his people in the way that he wishes he could, I continually saw him talking about the importance of translating hate into love, talking about the power of forgiveness and reconciliation, talking about the power of personal transformation. And even as he was crying with them, he was also laughing with them. And that experience fundamentally shaped who I am, and my experience around him, my time around him. So I've gotten to spend time with the community in exile. I spent a lot of time with the Tibetan community in exile. In Dharamsala, I spent time with Tibetans in Tibet, and I spent a lot of time with His Holiness. And so through that perspective, and actually we did a conference with the Dalai Lama at Brandeis University where we were talking about communities in exile, the Tibetan community in exile, the Jewish community in exile, and what we can learn from each other. So just being able to spend time with someone who's lived it, not just theoretically, but in the way it impacted him and his community, has really brought me back to this idea that in our darkest times, that's when we have to apply our most, we have to apply our most ambitious spiritual principles. It's one thing to love the enemy when you have no enemies. It's another thing to love the enemy when you're imprisoned. So I think as we all go through the challenges in our life, let's really think about what our principles are and how we apply them, not when things are easy. It's easy to apply the things you believe when they conform with the world you're living in. It's much more difficult to apply the principles that you aspire to embody when you have challenge in your life. And I think to the extent that any of us as human beings or as faith practitioners want to support refugee communities, immigrant communities, people who've been alienated, disenfranchised, disempowered, dispossessed, the least among us, as Jesus would say, then we have to apply those principles during difficult times. It's a difficult time right now geopolitically to be talking about immigrant rights, refugee rights, etc. But that's why it's the most important time to talk about it.
That's very well stated. And isn't that a real universal takeaway from all of this? There's a letter in the New Testament, the Epistle of James, that says, this is true religion, to care for the widows and the orphans and the refugees and those who are in need. I haven't experienced this personally myself, but lots of my ancestors did. And I mentioned their diaries and writings because they have had a very important influence in my life. Let me just share with you the experience of one of my wife's ancestors, just to give you an idea of what Mormons went through in Missouri and Illinois, and eventually driving them all the way across the plains. Elizabeth Rawson was pregnant with twins, which would be her 5th and 6th children. This was in November of 1833. Her husband was required to surrender his arms to a mob of Missourians who came forcing them to leave where they were in Independence, Missouri. She had her other children, they were starving, and the 2 oldest children had to walk barefoot on frozen ground the entire way from Jackson County to Lafayette County, Missouri. This was in December and January. Elizabeth records in her journal, she felt so miserable she wanted to die. And that's, we know this is the extreme feelings that they're having. She says, but after being administered to by the priesthood, or having her spiritual strength regenerated, she felt her health and spirit restored. Well, they then moved to another town called Far West. And 5 years later, they will again be raided, their home burned, their livestock and poultry confiscated, and even their clothing stolen. And once again, they have to walk from the middle of Missouri all the way to central Illinois, living in a state of fear. 6 years later, their home would be burned, their crops devastated, and hogs, sheep, and cattle left for the mob to take as they were forced once again. 3 times in a period of 12 years, this woman, who gave birth to 13 children, 11 of whom miraculously survived. Is this a refugee? I think so. But her indomitable spirit, she just never wanted to give up. She was so determined, and she always turned the other cheek, loving her enemies and fighting cholera, Indian attacks. It's quite a story to grow up hearing these things from my own ancestors' voices. But as things turned out for them, they did finally reach what they considered a promised land. And one of the questions we were asked was, what can we learn in our communities that will help us to take away lessons from these people? And I think number one is faith. Faith in God, faith in your spiritual sources of inspiration, of Jesus, the Dalai Lama, Muhammad, whatever it is. Faith will grow as it is tested in the fire. We don't get strong faith by simply going through a life of luxury and ease. And so in our home, we always talk about, we do hard things. Why do we do hard things? That's a part of our tradition.
Do we have any questions?
Well, thankfully we're a small group, so if you have questions, you're more than welcome to come up to one of us and ask. I just want to conclude by thanking the Office of Religious Life again for everything you do for the USC community, feeding us through good karma, feeding our mind through mindfulness, and feeding our soul through panel discussions like this.
I just throw out a question, Dan, but that is just something to stimulate conversation as we mingle afterwards. That is, if you look in the sacrificial altar out here in the temple, it has handles so you can slide poles through them so you can carry it away. And so here's the question for convo afterwards here, and that is, what are the handles on your faith traditions? What are the handles that make them portable, that make it so that you can carry those traditions with you? What are those handles for you? So, thank you all for showing up and for our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.